I sat there in the courtroom, under the harsh fluorescent lights, watching Amelia's face crumble. It was the moment the truth finally, undeniably came out, and I knew she'd been lying not just to me, but to herself, for years. To understand how we got to this point, how I ended up sitting across from the woman I once loved, watching her world collapse, you have to go back 3 years earlier. 3 years before this courtroom, Amelia had packed the same suitcase we took on our honeymoon. She looked me dead in the eye and told me she was leaving. Not for a trip, not for a short break. She was leaving to take care of her terminally ill ex-boyfriend, Marcos. She swore it wasn't about love, it was about being human, she said. She actually told me I should understand because I was supposedly such a good man. I stood there, paralyzed, watching her walk out that door, and in that moment, I remember thinking, maybe I was the crazy one for feeling like this was wrong. Everyone around us made me feel like a monster for even questioning it. Like wanting your wife to stay home instead of moving in with another man made me selfish. Her mom, bless her heart, called me cold-hearted. Her sister posted something on Facebook about how real love transcends ego. And even some of our friends started looking at me differently. But here's what nobody wanted to talk about. She didn't just leave to help him through chemo appointments or bring him groceries. She literally moved into his apartment. She stopped coming home. Amelia and I had been married for 4 years when this whole thing exploded. On paper, everything looked fine. We had a nice house in a quiet neighborhood in Raleigh, stable jobs. I'm an accountant, she worked in marketing for a local startup. We did normal couple stuff, arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash, planning vacations we'd probably never take. But there was always this thing she did, this habit of bringing up her ex, Marcos, way more than seemed normal. She'd say things like he was her first real love, that he taught her what it meant to be vulnerable. And I'd just nod because what are you supposed to do? Tell your wife to stop talking about her past? My mom noticed it, though. I'd catch her giving Amelia these looks at family dinners whenever his name came up, but she never said anything directly to me about it. The night everything changed started like any other evening. We were in bed. I was reading some boring financial report for work, and Amelia was scrolling through her phone when suddenly she gasped. I looked over. Her face had gone completely white, like she'd just seen something devastating. She told me Marcos was sick. Really sick. Stage 4 cancer with a bad prognosis. She started crying in this way that felt different from normal sadness. It was like grief mixed with panic, mixed with something I couldn't quite name. I held her, because that's what you do. And I said all the right things about how terrible it was and how sorry I felt for him. She cried herself to sleep that night, and I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering why it felt like I was comforting her over a current boyfriend instead of some guy from her past. The next few days were intense. She was constantly on her phone, texting his family, coordinating with his doctors, acting like she was his wife instead of me being hers. I tried to be understanding because, obviously, the guy was seriously ill, and that's horrible. But something felt profoundly off about the whole situation. Finally, I sat her down and suggested we could help in other ways. I offered to contribute money for his medical bills, set up meal deliveries, even drive her to visit him at the hospital. I told her we could do all of that while still maintaining our marriage and our home. She looked at me like I'd just suggested letting him suffer alone. You don't get it, she said. He doesn't have anyone else. His family lives across the country. Someone needs to be there for him every day. I pointed out that every day seemed like a lot, that maybe we could find a balance. And that's when she called me selfish. The argument that followed wasn't even really an argument. It was more like she'd already made her decision and was just angry I wasn't immediately agreeing with it. She said I'd never truly loved anyone if I couldn't understand what she needed to do. That real love meant sacrifice. That she couldn't live with herself if she abandoned him. What about abandoning me? I asked her. Abandoning our marriage? And she actually laughed, this bitter laugh, and said I was being dramatic. I'm not leaving you, she insisted. I'm taking care of someone who's seriously ill. There's a difference. I asked her how long she planned to be gone, and she couldn't give me an answer. I asked if she expected me to just wait around while she played nurse to her ex, and she said if I really loved her, I would. That's when I knew. This wasn't about compassion or humanity or any of the noble things she was claiming. This was about her choosing him over me and wanting me to call it something else so she didn't have to feel guilty about it. 3 days later, I came home from work and found her in our bedroom with that honeymoon suitcase open on the bed. She was packing methodically, not in a rushed way, like she'd been thinking about this for a while. I stood in the doorway watching her fold the same blue sweater I'd bought her for Christmas, and I asked if we could please talk about this one more time. She didn't even look up. She just kept packing and said she'd already made arrangements. That Marcos's lease allowed for a caretaker, that his insurance would cover most of the costs, but she'd need to be there full-time. Full-time, like a job, like a marriage. I asked her point blank if she was choosing him over me, and she finally stopped packing and turned around. One day, you'll understand that I'm doing the right thing, she said. You'll see that love isn't about ownership. It's about letting people do what they need to do. She finished packing while I just stood there, feeling paralyzed. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand she stay, to give her some kind of ultimatum. But another part of me was already calculating what divorce lawyers cost and whether I could afford the mortgage alone. She zipped up the suitcase, walked past me to the kitchen, and set her house keys on the counter with this decisive little click that sounded way too final. I followed her and watched as she picked up her purse and the suitcase and headed for the front door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob and looked back at me one last time. There were tears in her eyes, but her jaw was set. I realized she'd already cast herself as the hero of this story, and me as the villain who didn't understand sacrifice. The door closed behind her, and I stood there in the entryway of our house, our home, the place we'd picked out together and argued about paint colors for. And I finally understood that when someone wants to leave badly enough, they'll find a way to make it your fault for trying to make them stay. I watched those doors close, and I didn't know yet that they were closing forever. That this wasn't some temporary insanity she'd snap out of after a few weeks. I thought maybe she'd realize what she was throwing away and come back apologizing. I actually thought that, like an idiot. I thought love and history and marriage vows meant something more than whatever she was chasing by running back to her first love's hospital bedside. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. And it would take 3 years, and a baby that wasn't mine, to teach me exactly how wrong. 3 years is a long time to rebuild your life. And I'd like to say I spent every day of it thinking about her, but that would be a lie. The truth is, after about 6 months of waiting for her to come back, I finally accepted she wasn't coming home, and I needed to move on. I filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment, which in our state meant she'd willfully left our home without intent to return for more than 6 consecutive months. The process was surprisingly easy since she never contested it. Never even responded to the papers my lawyer sent to Marcos's apartment. I sold the house about 18 months after she left, because every room reminded me of conversations we'd had about our future, about kids we'd planned to have, about growing old together in that exact spot. I moved into a smaller apartment across Charlotte, started going to the gym again, reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage. My mom stopped giving me those worried looks at family dinners and started asking if I was dating anyone yet. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. And I'd forgotten what that felt like. So, when I got a call one Saturday afternoon from a number I didn't recognize, I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end belonged to the guy who'd bought our old house. And he sounded annoyed and confused in equal measure. He said a woman had just shown up at his door with a toddler and luggage, claiming it was her house and demanding to be let in. He told her the house had been sold over a year ago, and she'd apparently broken down crying on his doorstep, asking where I was. He said he'd felt bad for her, so he'd looked up my contact info from the closing documents and given her my new address to get her to leave his property. He wanted to warn me that she was probably headed my way. And honestly, he sounded like he regretted getting involved at all. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there on my couch, trying to process the fact that Amelia was about to show up at my apartment after 3 years of complete silence. About 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang, and there she was. She looked different, older somehow, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The kid was maybe 2 years old, had his thumb in his mouth, and was staring at me with these huge brown eyes that definitely weren't mine. She had that same suitcase from our honeymoon sitting at her feet, along with another beat-up duffel bag. And for a second, I felt like I was watching a movie of my own life from the outside. "I know this is unexpected," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But I didn't know where else to go, and I figured you'd understand." She was already moving toward the door like she expected me to step aside. Like the last 3 years had just been some brief intermission, and now we were picking up where we left off. I didn't step aside. I just stood there, blocking the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. She looked annoyed that I wasn't immediately welcoming her in, and she adjusted the kid, Leo, on her hip. "Marcos passed away about 4 months ago," she said, matter-of-factly, like she was telling me about a cancelled appointment. And I realized she'd already done her grieving and moved on to whatever came next. I told her I was sorry for her loss because that seemed like the human thing to say, and she nodded like she was accepting condolences at a funeral. Then she hit me with it. "His family took back the apartment right after he was gone," she said. "I've been staying with different friends, but nobody can handle a toddler long-term, and I just need a place to land while I figure things out." She said all of this while trying to push past me into my apartment, like she had every right to be there. I put my hand on the doorframe and asked her why she thought coming here was appropriate. She looked at me like I'd asked the stupidest question in the world and said we had history, that we'd built a life together, that she knew I'd understand because I was a good person. I almost laughed at that, at the idea that being a good person meant letting your ex-wife, who abandoned you, move back in with another man's kid. She kept talking, saying she'd sacrificed everything for Marcos, given up her job and her life to care for him during his final months, and now she had nothing. She looked down at Leo, then back at me with this calculated expression. "You always wanted children," she said. "Leo needs a stable home, a father figure, and you could have that now." That's when I realized she wasn't here because she missed me or regretted leaving. She was here because I was convenient. Stable. The safe backup plan she kept in her pocket while she played out her great tragic love story with someone else. I went back into my apartment, leaving her standing in the hallway, and grabbed the folder I kept in my desk drawer. I'd held onto the divorce papers because my lawyer said to keep them for tax purposes. But now, I was glad I had them for a completely different reason. I came back to the door and handed her the papers, watching her face as she flipped through them and saw the final decree stamped and signed by a judge. "We're not married," I said. "Haven't been for over 2 years, and this isn't your home." "It never was." She stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. And I could see her mentally recalculating whatever plan she'd had when she decided to track me down. Leo started fussing, and she bounced him automatically while still looking at those divorce papers. She asked me about the house, our house, and I told her I'd sold it 18 months ago. She looked up at me with genuine shock, like she couldn't believe I'd moved on without waiting for her to decide if she wanted to come back. "You sold our house," she said, her voice getting louder. "That was our home, our investment. You had no right." I reminded her that she'd abandoned that home, abandoned the marriage, and that I'd had every legal right to sell a property I'd been solely paying for after she walked out. Leo was crying now, probably picking up on his mother's stress, and part of me felt bad for him because none of this was his fault. Amelia tried a different approach, softening her voice and saying, "We didn't have to be married for me to help her." She said, "We had history, that what we'd shared meant something, that she knew deep down I still cared about her." She was right that I cared in some distant way, the same way you care about anyone you spent years of your life with. But caring wasn't the same as being responsible for her choices. I asked her about Leo's father, and she got defensive immediately. She said it was complicated, that she didn't want to talk about it, that it didn't matter because he wasn't in the picture. I told her that actually it mattered a lot, because that person should be the one helping her, not her ex-husband whom she'd walked out on to be with another man. She called me cruel, said I was punishing her for doing the right thing, for being there for someone who needed her. I looked at her, standing in my hallway with this kid who had nothing to do with me. And I felt something shift inside my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, more like clarity. You made your choice 3 years ago, I said. You chose Marcos over our marriage, over our future, over everything we'd built together. And that's fine. That was your right. But you don't get to come back now and act like I owe you something because your plan didn't work out the way you wanted. She stared at me like I was a stranger, like the man she'd married would never say something like that to her. Maybe she was right. Maybe the man she'd married would have let her walk all over him, would have taken her back out of guilt or habit or some misguided sense of duty. But I wasn't that man anymore. She picked up her suitcases, struggling a bit with the weight while holding Leo, and I didn't offer to help. She looked at me one more time, and I could see her cycling through emotions. Anger, disbelief, humiliation, something that might have been genuine sadness. You're going to regret this, she said. One day you'll realize you threw away a chance at having a real family. I told her I hoped she figured things out, that I genuinely wished her and her son well, but that she needed to leave now. She walked down the hallway toward the elevator, and I watched her go. This woman I'd once planned to spend my entire life with. Now just someone I used to know who'd made choices I couldn't follow. When I closed the door, I stood there for a minute, just breathing. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated or any of the things you're supposed to feel when you stand up for yourself. I felt tired and a little sad, and mostly just done with the whole situation. I thought that would be the end of it, that she'd move on and find someone else to rescue her, that our paths would never cross again. I poured myself a drink and sat on my couch in my apartment that she'd never lived in, surrounded by furniture she'd never picked out. And I felt the weight of 3 years finally lift off my shoulders. The doors had closed, this time for good, and I was okay with that. Or at least I thought I was, right up until 6 months later, when I accidentally discovered she was in the middle of a legal war. And that's when things got really interesting. I wasn't planning to have anything to do with Amelia ever again after she left my apartment that day. But life has a weird way of pulling you back into situations you thought you'd escaped. About 6 months after she showed up at my door, I ran into an old mutual friend at a coffee shop, and she immediately got this awkward look on her face like she knew something I didn't. After some uncomfortable small talk, she finally told me that Amelia was in the middle of a legal battle with Marcos's family over his estate. Apparently, she'd been calling herself his widow, claiming they'd had some kind of common law situation, and demanding a portion of his life insurance and property. The friend said it was getting messy, that Amelia was insisting Leo was Marcos's biological son and therefore entitled to inheritance, and that the whole thing was headed to court. I thanked her for the information and tried to act like it didn't concern me, but something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. A few weeks later, I got a subpoena to appear as a witness, which completely blindsided me. Marcos's family's lawyer wanted me to testify about the timeline of Amelia leaving our marriage and moving in with Marcos, apparently to establish exactly when she'd abandoned me to be with him and whether that timeframe supported her claims of a committed relationship. I didn't want any part of it. Called my old divorce lawyer and told him I'd rather stay out of the whole mess. But he explained I didn't really have a choice once I'd been subpoenaed. So, on a cold morning in late February, I found myself walking into a courthouse I'd never wanted to see, wearing the same suit I'd worn to our divorce hearing, about to watch my ex-wife's life fall apart in real time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, nothing like the dramatic TV versions with massive galleries and wood paneling everywhere. Marcos's parents were sitting on one side with their lawyer, both of them looking exhausted and angry in that specific way people look when they're grieving and fighting at the same time. Amelia sat on the other side with Leo in a stroller next to her. And she'd clearly dressed for maximum sympathy, modest dress, minimal makeup, hair pulled back simply. When she saw me walk in, her face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds before settling on this cold mask of betrayal, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by showing up to a hearing I'd been legally forced to attend. I took a seat in the back and waited for my name to be called, feeling like I was watching a car crash in slow motion. The hearing itself was technical and boring at first. Lots of discussion about estate law and what constitutes a common law marriage in our state. But then Marcos's family's lawyer started presenting evidence that made my stomach turn. Medical records showing that Marcos had undergone aggressive chemotherapy that left him unable to have children, documented by his oncologist in writing with specific dates and test results. Bank statements proving that Amelia had been receiving money from Marcos's parents during his illness, money they'd sent specifically to help with his care that she'd apparently been using for her own expenses. And then the timeline, laid out in black and white on a projected screen for everyone to see. Marcos had been declared medically unable to father children 8 months before Leo was born, and Amelia had still been legally married to me for part of the time frame when she would have gotten pregnant. The lawyer wasn't subtle about the implications, and I watched Amelia's face go pale as she realized where this was heading. When it was my turn to testify, the questions were straightforward and factual. When had Amelia left our marriage? Had she given any indication of when she planned to return? Had there been any contact between us during the 3 years she was gone? I answered honestly because I'd sworn an oath and because lying wouldn't have helped anyone. Amelia's lawyer tried to make me look bitter and vindictive on cross-examination, asked if I was angry at my ex-wife, if I wanted to see her punished for leaving me. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, that I'd moved on with my life, and that I was just there because I'd been subpoenaed to provide factual testimony about dates and events. The judge seemed to appreciate the directness because she nodded and dismissed me pretty quickly after that. I went back to my seat and watched the rest of the hearing unfold like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. The moment that really stuck with me was when Marcos's mother took the stand. She was in her 60s, wearing all black, and she had this quiet dignity about her even though you could tell she was barely holding it together. She talked about her son's illness, about how grateful she'd been that someone was there to care for him in his final months, about how she'd sent money and supplies and never questioned Amelia's presence because she seemed genuinely devoted to him. Then her voice changed, got harder, and she said that within weeks of Marcos passing, Amelia had immediately started making claims about being his common-law wife, about Leo being his biological child, about deserving compensation for her years of sacrifice. My son couldn't have children after his treatment, she said, her voice breaking. The doctors told us that explicitly, and she knows it because she was there for those appointments. She heard the same information we did. That's when I saw Amelia's lawyer lean over and whisper something urgent to her, and whatever he said made her face crumble. The judge didn't need long to make her ruling. She said the medical evidence was conclusive and irrefutable, that Leo could not biologically be Marcos's child, and that Amelia's claims to common-law marriage status were further undermined by the fact that she'd still been legally married to me for a significant portion of the time she was living with Marcos. The petition was denied in its entirety. Amelia was ordered to return money she'd already received from the estate, and she was held responsible for court costs for bringing what the judge called a frivolous claim. It was clinical and efficient. And watching it happen, I felt this strange mix of vindication and pity. Vindication because finally someone in authority was calling out her delusions and lies. But pity because she'd clearly believed her own story so completely that having it torn apart in public seemed to genuinely shock her. I left the courthouse before she did because I didn't want another confrontation. But as I was walking to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't have saved. I knew immediately it was her because she'd probably kept my contact information all these years, even after I deleted hers. The message said she hoped I was happy, that I'd gotten what I wanted, that she'd never forgive me for humiliating her like this in front of everyone. I stared at that text for a long moment, and then I blocked the number and deleted the message without responding. What was there to say? That I hadn't wanted any of this? That she'd brought it on herself by trying to profit off someone's estate with a child that wasn't his? That she'd rewritten history so many times she'd lost track of what was actually true? None of it would have mattered, because she'd already decided I was the villain in her story, and nothing I said would change that narrative she'd constructed. Over the next few weeks, I heard through various channels that she'd lost more than just the court case. Friends who'd supported her through everything started distancing themselves once the details became public knowledge. Her reputation in our old social circle was completely destroyed, and people were apparently sharing the court documents on social media like some kind of cautionary tale about narcissism and entitlement. I didn't participate in any of that. Didn't comment or share or add my perspective, because honestly, what was the point? She'd made her choices and now she was living with the consequences, and I was finally truly free of the whole situation. I never heard from her again after I blocked that number, and I was grateful for the silence. Looking back now, I don't hate Amelia. Hate requires too much energy, and I don't have any left to spare for her or that chapter of my life. What I understand now is that she built this entire identity around being the person who sacrificed everything for love, who was noble and selfless and above ordinary concerns like marriage vows or basic honesty. She needed that story to justify leaving me, to make sense of throwing away a stable life for someone who was seriously ill. And when that story stopped working, she just kept telling it anyway. Kept adding new chapters that made her the hero. The world doesn't reward you for the narratives you create about your own choices. And she learned that the hard way, in front of a judge and a courtroom full of people. I learned something, too. Something maybe even more valuable. That my boundaries weren't cruelty. That protecting myself wasn't the same as being heartless. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's delusion. She always believed people owed her something for her sacrifices, but nobody ever asked her to sacrifice anything. She just did it and then tried to send everyone else the bill. What do you think was Amelia's biggest mistake?